Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development podcast. We are very, very lucky to be joined by Dr. Anthea Clarke. Thank you very much for joining us. Do you want to give us a bit of your background?
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me. So I am a senior lecturer in sport and exercise science at Latrobe University. My areas in general are around exercise physiology and applied sports science. And I have a particular interest and research flavour, I suppose, of the female athlete.
That actually brings up a question we had for you, because one of the things that is obvious when you look at your publications is you've actually got quite a bit of diversity in different research
We were
fields.
very impressed. I was like, she's doing research across so many areas and that's really cool.
Well, it's very uncommon these days too, because there seems to be a big pressure to focus on one particular topic and just go into depth, where you're covering a lot of different areas. What's the motivation for that?
Yeah, so if I go back to the start of my research journey where I started working, doing my PhD. My PhD was in women's rugby sevens, so I was with the Australian Institute of Sport and University of Canberra. They were going into the 4-year cycle leading into the first Olympics at Rio. So the first time sevens were going into the Olympics.
Yeah. That worked out well.
Yeah.
It did. I'd like to say I had a part, but I'm not sure. And so rugby sevens at that time had a big... the men's program had been working for a couple of years. There was a bit of research available. Women's, they'd only had a couple of international tournaments. There was nothing consistent for them. And there was pretty much no research there. So when I started my PhD, I was looking at this vast landscape of going, okay, well, what should I be doing this research in? What's going to be most beneficial? And so it started there by just me touching into little bits of areas of going, okay, well, I think understanding what they're doing in a game is really important. I also think understanding the development pathway and tracking of athletes is really important, and how we monitor them. And actually rugby is a really unique game in that you get a lot of muscle damage. So what does that look like in our athletes, and how can we then improve the recovery process for them? So it really started in that open landscape in rugby sevens, and then since finishing my PhD and going into, I guess, again, broad research, I'm back in that open landscape of, well, there's still so much areas in sports science literature that we don't know about female athletes. And we need to cover a lot of bases quickly to upskill. So it's really come from that. Yeah.
And the other thing I'm interested to know too is you're given that opportunity now to continue to explore on lots of different fields. There's not a pressure to then focus on one particular area.
Yeah, so I say my research area is female athletes, but I went to a female athlete conference and suddenly that's too broad of a research area to be saying that you're in. Yeah. It's a bit of an active decision that I've made to try and keep it broad, and one of the reasons for that is that, and really it applies in male athletes as well, but nothing happens in isolation. We can't just look at physiology over here and injury prevention over there. There's so much of it that's interconnected, and then you start adding layers of, okay, well, athlete development and opportunities and what's the social environment and how that contributes to the access that they've got and the professionalisation that they can have. So I like to keep it broad, and I like being able to have that opportunity to draw in lots of those different areas so that we get a bit more of a better holistic idea of what's going on. It's
interesting you say that, because that's certainly a frustration of mine. I think probably John feels the same, where I feel like there's becoming too much, everything's becoming a bit too siloed actually. And you certainly see where so much of what's done in the clinical field is being driven by research and researchers, but the issue that you have then is what that researcher knows and what they potentially don't know influences the messages that they give. And sometimes it can start to become quite refined of, in our world of, if you've got this particular injury, this is what you need to do. And often as a clinician, you're looking at it going, well, I think you're missing a few other key variables here. Do you see that changing, or what do you...
Because you seem to be unique in the fact that you're looking at this as a much more complex problem sort of array. And the big thing that we talk about a lot is understanding the interactions that occur between those factors, and often they're very difficult to quantify. So people put it in the too hard basket because those interactions by nature are non-linear. So it's like, we don't know what's coming out. We're just going to pretend that only this and this influences this outcome.
Yeah. And to a degree, I think you need that. You need to be able to simplify and really drill down on one specific area, and you need researchers that learn that small, tiny bit of information, but then you need other researchers that can take that little bits of information and pull it together with others. It's like the same sort of battle goes on, research versus practice. Research is normally really slow, quite isolated, very controlled, very specific, and then you've got what happens in practice. It's fast, it's complex, it's messy, you don't really know. And ideally, like, the best research is when you can combine those two areas together in some way, shape or form. So I think it's a constant evolution of out and in, of broad to narrow, and then pulling where you need. It's tough. I don't think everything should be moving in one direction necessarily. It's that balance of play.
It's a bit of a tangent, but it's clear that obviously for you, that's you find that sort of generalist thinking valuable. You know, having skills that kind of go across a few different areas, even within that broad topic. That's not, as Jack said, that's not always popular, but is it something that's innate to you, that you are just a very curious person and you want to look across this, or do you think that that's something that you specifically went to develop for other reasons?
I'm definitely a generalist, just in how I approach things. I'm not very good at really narrowing down on a single thing, and there's so many other...
And have you always been like that? Is that like a personality thing?
Definitely. I can't do one thing. Like, I've got to touch into lots, and I like that balance and play between them. I mean, I am a generalist, and I try and bring in as much as I know of and am aware of, but then I still go through some of these projects and realise that there's this entire element that I've completely forgotten or had no idea about that probably has a really big impact on this. And that's someone who is actively trying to read wide and pull things together. It's hard to do it in its entirety and to do it well, but I really like it that way.
Yeah, no, you know, you're, as I say, you're speaking to the choir, like we're or preaching to the choir. You know, we very much believe that, and it's one of the reasons why our setting kind of looks like this rather than like a typical setting for an injury clinic, because if you don't add those extra elements, you're not really going to be addressing a lot of the factors that contribute to the development of, say, an injury or even performance.
Well, I think what it highlights too is it's more, you've almost got that partly that, you know, clinicians or coaches mindset, because I feel like so often I'll read something or I'll learn something new and go, okay, well, I need to integrate that into my framework of how I look at a problem, where it seems to be that can be challenging in a research setting, because there's so much focus and it takes so much time to focus on one particular project. How much time do you actually have to learn about other areas that actually are probably very relevant to what you're looking at, but at the same time, you know, not lose focus or attention on what you're doing there?
Yeah, or what your research says is this very specific thing that you need to be doing, but in practice, the ability to implement that doesn't work. So you might have the answer to the problem, but if the athlete doesn't want to do that type of exercise or the program that you think is going to change the world in injury prevention, then it's not going to work.
Yeah.
Well, I think that brings on to an interesting topic, because with this conference, we were talking about the women in sport one.
Yeah,
I attended that. I really enjoyed it. And I know that one of the presenters who did his work, he does his work, Matt Whalen, who does his work in soccer, was complaining about people not doing things like Nordics.
Yeah.
Right. And it's an interesting conversation, because I think it goes in both directions, you know, with like working with the athletes, working with the coaches, working with the clinicians, or working with the sports science team of like, how does this all integrate? Are you seeing some of those barriers starting to be broken down as we're seeing? I think there is much better translation of practical research now, and people implementing themselves. A lot of the times it's like through their PhD, as you mentioned, it's like similar to what you did with Sevens.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's starting to break some of those barriers down, and we're getting even the athletes understanding, these people are here to try and understand what we're doing and maybe help the whole overall process?
Yeah, I think historically translation of research has been pretty terrible by researchers and academics, but landscapes like this where we've got podcasts and the ability to be on social media and to create infographics, I think that's a natural evolution that researchers are realising these are easy ways that they can be getting their information out to coaches, to athletes.
I was going to say, so when you say it's the communication element has been terrible, do you just mean in terms of getting the message out there, or the specific message that's being delivered?
Getting the message out there.
Yeah, okay.
We're probably also not very good at tailoring the message to hit how athletes listen or take on information as well. But I think it's more around just getting it in front of them. As academics, you know, we get a pat on the back when we get a publication, but they don't really ask for how we've translated that information and got that back to community or to the end user of who might actually use that information.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I'm about to say, from what I understand in research, so much of your success is based on how many publications you have.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, as opposed to the actual effect of each publication itself.
Yeah. So I was lucky to get a grant a couple of years ago around working with coaches of female athletes. And we did a research study, and one of the outputs of getting that grant was you need to be translating this back to community. So that was a forced element that was part of this grant that we had to do. And so it was probably the first time that I actually thought about actively, okay, how do I bring this back to community then? What's the best way? COVID ended up hitting, and so we couldn't do a one-day presentation to some coaches that happened to be in the area. What we ended up doing then was developing this online course, which has now gone out to 1,000 coaches throughout Australia, a couple of international as well. We've got experts from multiple areas touching in on their areas, and it's such a better way to translate information. And then the conversations as well, that the participants of that course are connecting with each other, and they're able to then learn off each other and build their own community of practice and networks there. Like, it's been a really nice way to see how research translation can happen in a good way.
On that specifically, here's a question that I think I'm always interested in, because I coach high-level females, and I've been asked this question myself, so I'm interested to hear what you have to say about it, is how do you think coaching females is different to just being a coach who is aware of the individual that's in front of you?
That's a very good question. There's probably multiple layers that can contribute to that. If you think about coaching a female based on physiology, like, you know, what they need to train to get better, there's not much difference in it. Anecdotally, a lot of coaches who have worked with both males and females, particularly from a team sport background, I've had the feedback that, you know, female athletes are interested and want to know more about why you're doing this and how's it going to benefit them, and having a bit more of a chat about it, whereas some of the male athletes are just happy to jump in and do it. And so how you engage with them might be different. But then if you think about it away from just physiology of coaching that athlete in the training practice principles, you then have other things that you might need to consider. You know, does their menstrual cycle affect them? It doesn't affect everyone, but maybe it affects some athletes, and that you need to consider that. Nutrition can be a little bit different. You know, they've got higher needs for iron. You're probably, depending on what sort of sport you're working with, your athlete may be at higher risk of relative energy deficiency syndrome or in sport. And so that's going to potentially change how you look at managing and monitoring that athlete to make sure that they are healthy and progressing well with what training loads you put in with them.
The reason I ask that is I don't see it differently at all.
Yeah.
And the reason is I coach individual sport. So every single one of my athletes, I think, has their own individual plan. If they're female, obviously you are integrating some of the things that you're saying.
Yeah.
But I have male athletes who are in the exact same position where we're not maybe monitoring their menstrual cycle, but there are, say, individual mental health plans that we have to have in place for that person that some of my female athletes don't need.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because I heard the same thing, and I heard people talk about that difference between the instruction. I don't know that I've noticed that personally. Doesn't mean it's not true. I think in the team setting it's probably very different.
Yeah, potentially.
But I actually think that like one of the things that I'm always really interested in and we've spoken about this a lot and I think I cop criticism from some other track coaches because I'm so individualized with how I coach my guys, right? But I think that that's the next stage when we get to performance in team settings that needs to happen. And when that happens, I think that a lot of these differences that are being, suggested to be fast will actually shrink, and it'll be much more about just actually understanding how to create an integrated plan for the person that's in front of you, rather than saying like, obviously it's relevant what their sex is, but it's not necessarily, as you mentioned, like on a number of levels. If you just treat the person in front of you, you're probably in a position where you're going to manage the factors that are important for that person.
Yeah, I mean, if you can be so individualized that you're working with that athlete and you're in tune to how they're feeling and whether they look flat or whether they haven't slept well, great, that's a focus. If someone says that they're a bit fatigued or sore, whether it's because of their menstrual cycle phase or something else, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, you're still going to manage it in an appropriate manner.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the differences or challenges is when, I guess in a team sport environment, it's harder to be so individualised.
Yeah, you don't have the resources, do you?
Don't have the resources, and you're then having to rely on your athlete to understand how they're responding to things so that they can flag something with you.
Yep. And you think that's mostly education? I think you tend to see I've worked with a number of team sport athletes at professional level, much more on a consulting kind of basis, and you typically find as they get older, they get really good at being like, I know that I can't do this or I can do this, but like, oh no, we can push this a bit harder. They just get really good at being able to self-report a lot of those things. Do you think that that's like an education and kind of experience thing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely about education and knowing. It's about empowering the athlete to also learn themselves. So if you're just prescribing them their training and their recovery and what they should be eating at every moment of the time, they're not necessarily, they're not developing those skills to understand their body and to respond accordingly. So if you can be empowering them to understand what's going on in their own body and how they're tracking and feeling at any day, at any time, that's absolutely where you want your athletes to be from an education perspective. And then having the confidence and the language that they can then tell you.
Question I have for you, like I've been asked this a number of times, but I'm not an expert on it, and I probably come across as an absolute dickhead when I say this stuff. Mm-hmm. Given that you worked with the Sevens team, and obviously menstrual cycle has been something that's being studied more and more and more. My personal opinion is it's difficult to manage around that in the sense that you can't pick when your competitions are. Mm-hmm. So if you start to enter into a mindset where you need to change everything around that, you're potentially creating some psychological fragility for that athlete around performance. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that you don't need to have very clear strategies if someone say like, oh, I'm actually in discomfort, I have this, I have that. But I've had athletes go into major championships at international level being like, I got my period this morning. And you don't want them in their head thinking that automatically means my performance is down, even if you know there are some physiological changes. Right? That's a weird game to play as a coach. Yep. What are some of the strategies that you guys used at Sevens to be able to manage that? Because obviously you go into the Olympics, you can't be like, oh, we can't play Thursday because half the team, has their cycle starting. Yeah. Or that not, or we're in the mid-cycle, so we can't do this or whatever. Yeah.
And it's not just a challenge around menstrual cycle tracking, it's all tracking. Like this sort of phenomenon has come up in sleep tracking as well. If a watch tells them that they've slept bad, do they suddenly can't perform? Yeah. Even though they felt that they maybe slept okay, but the watch is telling them otherwise. Yeah. I would say that menstrual cycle tracking, again, it comes back to that education. It's not about saying, well, firstly, the research isn't there to say that performance is worse at any specific time point. So
that's what I interpreted, but I'm happy to be corrected.
Maybe research in the future does come back with that. My thoughts is that the experiences that everyone has of a menstrual cycle is so different that we're never going to see that clear differentiation. Maybe for some individuals it's really helpful and beneficial for them. For others, they don't have a care in the world, so why would you add an extra thing that they need to start tracking? I think it comes down to again, that building that self-awareness and knowledge of how they're going. Like, okay, you're in this phase of the cycle. You've said that you've got cramps and this, but you still pumped out a good really session. Well, yeah. You're still doing well. You might feel shit, but it's okay. And so it's about going, it's showing that just because you've got your period or just because you're feeling a little shitty today doesn't mean that you can't perform just as well as any other day.
Well, I think the other thing it highlights too is, as a part of human nature, particularly if you're an elite or professional athlete, you're not always going to feel great.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and like
a lot of times you feel terrible.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, as you get older, you naturally get it. You've been through a number of years of the menstrual cycle, and so you can tolerate and deal with most things. For a youth athlete, maybe the story changes a little bit more in that they don't have that background, and so creating an environment where it's okay for them to say that they do have really bad cramps today and they don't want to train, and okay, well, let's work with you on that. It's not a deal breaker. You don't have to not do anything. You don't have to step away from the team, but let's just find what works for you today so that, like...
I think that's a really good point. Sorry, I'm interrupting you, but I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed about more of this research coming out and being much more of even like the coaching education side of things or even clinical side of things is the conversations are getting a hell of a lot easier.
Yeah.
So like I think even 4 or 5 years ago, I'm an open person. So, you know, with my athletes, we talk about that stuff all the time. And people found it weird that I'm talking with my female athletes openly, like, oh, my period started this morning. And I'm like, okay, how are you feeling? Do you need to take, you know, some pain relief, or do you need to do this? And they understood really quickly, as you just mentioned, like the session's not changing or you're still going to compete, but what do we need to do to support you at this point? And I think that even in 4 or 5 years, that's really changed with how people kind of are willing, especially male coaches, I would say.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, okay, that's just part of my coaching parameters. Like I need to be aware of what's going on with this and communicate openly with my athlete.
Yeah.
As I said, it's a bit different maybe with, you know, younger athletes or youth. But that's actually been really nice because some of that stigma of like, oh, we don't want to talk about that is disappearing.
It's just adding context to what's going on in that athlete's life at that point in time, right?
And I think also too, starting to get them familiar and comfortable with knowing that there's still a lot of things that you can do or that you may have to compete in that state, because that's just the reality of the situation as well. I was actually made me think of a question we had for you too with regards to a very interesting paper you published looking at stresses associated with elite performance.
Yeah, you have some awesome research, by the way.
This is looking at, I think it was looking at sleep, looking at cortisol levels, which again was really fascinating because it's really opening and highlighting the multi-dimensional nature of injury and performance.
Yeah, and that's sort of, as you said, like that's sort of the influence of sort of the cultural and social kind of aspects. You know, you said like you put in there the fact there's lots of different pressures. You know, you've got performance pressures, but then you've got, you know, financial pressures. You've got all of these different things going on.
And you mentioned this before, because this is always an interesting topic where, one, you can't forget about how these non-physical factors are associated with performance and injury mitigation with regards to sleep, with regards to diet, with regards to just personal psychological stresses. But at the same time too, that is a part of being like human, and that is a part of actually, particularly for elite performance, being exposed to those stresses, experiencing that overreaching phenomenon continuously to actually build up capacity. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts of how do we manage that conversation of bringing this information to the front of going, we need to be cognizant of the multiple factors associated with someone's performance, but at the same time too, realising that there are going to be times where you're going to have to experience fatigue and discomfort and be able to push through.
Seems like a very big question.
Yeah.
And you've got 2 minutes to answer it. We like to ask the complex ones.
Right. Where do I start with that? I think it's very much about bringing that athlete on the journey with you. So if you're coaching athletes, yes, you could just keep them in the dark and throw all this stuff at them and see how they respond and see their sleep dip or their recovery not be so good, and they start getting grumpy at you and you go, yes, it's working. But I think it's also nice, again, it's about educating an athlete, bringing them along, going, okay, this is what we're aiming for in this period. It's going to be tough for you, but let's push through. I promise there's an end point. We will get through this. I'm not here to hurt you. It's just about your development. And I think if, like a lot of it's building good relationships, that they trust you, that you are doing the right thing by them. Hope and see how it goes.
I find this really interesting, right? Because as I would say, I feel it fit into the era of younger coaches, right? But I'm very interested in the history of like particularly coaching pedagogy and understanding kind of, and we've seen a huge change, I think, particularly in the professional sports. And obviously most of those coaches have been male, but they were what people would consider old school.
Yeah.
They didn't care what you thought.
No.
Just do what you're told.
Yeah.
And if you're not good enough, too bad for you.
Yeah. If you don't break, great.
Right. Then there's the other side of it where you can go to the other extreme. And I think we've seen a little bit of this of like, oh, the athlete doesn't want to do that, so we're just going to pamper them. I hope that we're getting closer to a middle ground on that, because I think one of the things that I find really interesting, and I don't know whether your research has looked into this or whether it's just going to be something that you're kind of putting together, but I think one of the problems that we have at the moment with some part of the psychological realm of performance is actually the willingness to push people to adapt to psychological stress, because mental health has become such an issue where a lot of people are scared to actually see what they can do to extend people.
Yeah.
You know, someone go, oh, well, I'm really stressed out because of the way that you're treating me. And it's like, well, okay, maybe I'm doing that on purpose. I want to see what you do and I want to see if you learn from this.
Yeah.
And there's clear lines on that, I think, with have you actually given them some strategies? Are you actually teaching them what you want them to kind of process through? Are there support structures around? But at what level are you actually expecting them to start going, well, this is part of the high stress environment that is elite sport?
I can't answer that.
No, I know. I know that might be the case, but
I think also
you have more insight than we do, I guess.
Maybe. I think also we've seen some really bad stories come out in media about, you know, AFL preseason camps that have tried to do that stressful thing and it's pushed it too far. I know at the AIS for a couple of years they were doing like military boot camps, and they would just from a physical perspective, but then they were also doing some camps with cyclists where, you know, cycling is quite an international sport, and so they would do these simulations where no one spoke English and they just had to muffle their way to work out how to get lunch that day. Just as a bit of a throw you in the deep end, see how you respond when no one can. With that? I think some people responded really well and others didn't. And whether they would respond differently if they got warned or told about it, but then that sort of changes the whole dynamic.
I think that what it highlights too is the magnitude of that stressor too large for certain individuals? Because there are some people who do cope and there are some people who don't cope. But I think it highlights that, like, we're really talking about how does an individual respond and adapt to psychological or emotional stress, which is such a key element to performance.
Yeah.
But I also think, well, similar to actually doing resistance training, what you program someone to do is really based on what's their current physical capacity, what's their training history and maturation. And I think of it similar in regards to developing the psychological traits, where you need to actually think of, well, where is this person? Because there are some people who may have a lot of psychological fragility, and actually where you start is going to be pretty simple. But you actually need to think about, how do I actually build up some of those anti-fragility capacities so that when this person gets into a situation where they are out of their comfort zone, you know, maybe that's because it might be related to a female with their menstrual cycle, or maybe related to having to travel internationally and having a change in your circadian rhythm and your environment. But ultimately, you need to actually do these things so that that person can be able to have an appropriate response to that situation, and be able to manage the physiological response from that stressor. and make sure that they can actually still have the same outcome
in
terms of performance.
Definitely. And you have that support the first couple of times, and each time you're taking away a little bit more and they're having to do more themselves. And
correct me because I don't know, but has there been research on stuff like that where they're like implementing those kind of it's probably not necessarily in your area, but that you've seen where they're like, let's expose them to this and then slowly like pull some of those resources back? And have you seen any of that before?
I haven't seen any of that research.
Because that would be really interesting, I think.
I can imagine it would be very difficult research to undertake.
Why is that?
Just from a methods perspective of how you set that up and
how you
what you look
the
at.
Starting point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's probably more, I think those sort of skills in that development you'd be better, or you're more likely to find from a practical perspective, and coaches going through that process and trying different things with different squads and developing how they think it works. That's obviously often low N=1 of case study type stuff, but I don't know any research that looks at it.
I have this ongoing kind of, and I'm sure you probably have the same, I have like a number of questions in my head that often like I'll argue with myself over. And it fits in a little bit into this topic, right, of, pushing people versus not pushing people and seeing who can kind of cope with it, who can't. And it's interesting because obviously Australia competes against countries that don't really care about some of these things. Like if you look at some of the like Eastern Bloc countries, places like China, it's kind of a numbers game at times. And often we actually outperform. So it suggests that a lot of the practices that we have are working. However, I'm always interested by this concept of like, are certain people going to make it anyway? And therefore, it's about supporting those who are going to make it. And those ones who, I always see them as a bit of a tease. Like they've got lots of talent, but they're a pain in the ass.
And they're not going to make it anyway because they don't have those attributes.
And psychologically often they don't have the skills to get to that level. But people get really enamored by the whole, like, I call it like the talent trap, right? Where someone has these skills, but they don't really want to be there. They don't really like the environment. And we've seen that a lot in a lot of, I think like a really common one, I won't name names, but we've seen it a lot in say like professional male football codes where there's this really good player and they disappear and people know they've had mental health issues, they've had this, and you think, were they going to make it or were they never going to make it because their makeup was just one where this environment was not a good environment for them as a person?
They actually weren't ready for the...
Well, maybe that was the thing, yeah.
Like, again, the stresses associated with that media attention, that social media exposure. Yeah.
But then you've also... There's cases of some of those individuals then move into a different club and for whatever reason...
doing well.
Doing well. So whether it is a little bit of support. There's also the... is it psychological skills that you can develop and improve, or is it a psychological ability, capacity of that's what your personality is? And so
and
some
how much
of
can
that,
you adapt? That's the other thing too. In that
some
domain.
of that you can't change. Some of the skills you can develop and evolve. But I mean, I think all elite athletes are a pretty intense, incredible, obsessive. Like you have to be an obsessive nature to be an elite athlete because it's your entire world and everything you eat, sleep, think about is on that sport. So there has to be some level of obsessiveness.
Yeah.
And I know for me, I always thought, lots of people told me I had the physiology, but I do not have that obsessive nature to get anywhere close to that. And so that's not something I...
even aspired to, basically.
I can't aspire to, but I'd be pushing against a brick wall if I was trying to get to that because that's not what my natural personality is.
No, I find it interesting, as I said, from the point of view of almost like talent ID, where to me that's almost more valuable than someone who's a super talent, but they're difficult. It's difficult for them to actually, as I said, want to be in that environment because it's just not them. And we've seen lots and lots of it, those people kind of come and go. And I know in my sport of track and field, people get really enamored by, say, junior talent. These people come through and they go, they're going to be a superstar, they're going to do this. And often I've been criticised by people who know me closely because I'm talking only to them, but I'm like, they're not going to make it. And they say, what do you mean? I was like, they capitulate every time they get to this level, like they're not going to make it. And they go, you can't say that, like it's harsh. I was like, no, they just don't actually have that killer instinct when they need to have it. And they've got all the ability, but they actually just don't have that killer instinct. Which
is probably one of the biggest challenges of talent ID. We could do all the physiological tests to know what their aerobic capacity is and their speed and their power, and that could be off the charts. I think there are some psych tests, but I don't know how good they are at actually tracking. So our ability to talent ID at a young age is actually really challenging, and there's not a lot of transfer. So those that are winners at under 18 nationals or worlds or whatever often aren't there in the senior years.
What do you think contributes to that? Aside from the psychological stuff, because we probably should move on from that. But what do you think contributes? As someone who has this background that you've got and you've seen a fair bit of elite sporting environments, but what do you think contributes to that lack of translation? Because it is a problem, I think, across a lot of sports.
There's probably a couple of things that go into it. I believe the latest guide is that we should be doing multi-sports until we're 18.
At least, sort of 16 on.
Maybe 16. You don't want to specialise too early. And so the ones that are probably doing really well in the early years are those that are specialising, but then they lose development of all these other skills.
Their ceiling lowers as a result.
Their ceiling lowers, and they also have been in it and have been such a high level in that sport. They get bored and burnt out and they're done with it and they don't have that longevity.
Do you think that has more to do, like to me that seems almost like a sports economics problem, right? It'll sound weird when I say that, but I think you'll understand, I'm not a huge fan of AFL, right? I think they steal too much media for a domestic sport, right? And I watch the sport, but to me it's a pretty pissy sport. Right?
If you lived anywhere outside of Melbourne, you'd be fine.
Yeah, I'd say I'm from New South Wales and Queensland, so I've been fully exposed to that.
Yeah. And it's not to say that I don't watch it. Like, I'm a Carlton supporter and I watch every game, even when they're losing all the time. But I think that they get way too much attention because they have the finances to push their media agenda. And one of the big problems that I've seen with sport development is from a really early age, they hook particularly Victorian kids into, you've got to come to the NAB League, such and such, under 15s. And these kids are not going to make it because they're probably not that good at this stage, but they're telling them, you've got to come to this, and you've got to come to this, and you've got to come to this. And it forces them to think that they need to specialise really early. And the reason they're doing that is I don't think it's about the development of those players. It's really because they want to maintain their position as the number one sport, particularly in Victoria. And I'll be open, it's a massive frustration that I saw with the development of AFLW, right, is they stole a lot of athletes from other sports because the athletes wanted, I don't know what it was they were looking for, but they sort of got caught up in the hype of that when they were probably better at the other sport they were doing anyway. But that's marketing and that's, publicity and that's having, particularly influence in certain aspects. Do you think that one, it probably can't change, but do you think that that's an influence on why people are being driven to specialise early?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I mean, if I go back to rugby sevens, theoretically that should be the most exciting team sport that could be played in Australia because it's got the chance of going to the Olympics. AFL doesn't go to the Olympics. Yeah. Rugby, you can play World Cup, rugby league.
Yeah, even soccer's the same. Like soccer for the Olympics is not that big a deal. They've got the major World Cup is much bigger.
Yeah, and yet rugby sevens, men's and women's, is probably on the lower end of what people are choosing because there isn't that advertising and promotion and spectacle.
Everyone knows about the Wallabies, but not many people know about the sevens.
Yeah, and I mean, from a professionalisation, the men's and women's have been professional for a while now, but it's a pretty small group. Whereas AFLW, generally athletic females have the chance of being athletes and being paid as athletes. Maybe it's only for a couple of months of the year, but that's their first opportunity of really thinking that they can be termed an athlete and get paid for that. Soccer obviously does it very well as well, and netball would be the two key ones. But for those other team sports, more contact, less traditional, that's an opportunity. And so I get why lots of athletes are going to AFLW. It makes sense.
You can't blame them. That makes sense why they're doing it. I still don't think that a lot of them should have, but it's not my position to say what someone should or shouldn't do.
Yeah, I mean, even if we go outside of women's sport, like if draftees of AFL, most of them last their 2 years and then they're out. But it sounds good to get drafted, and that's a really special thing. But if that's what they've been working to for the last 5 years, there's going to be a lot of come down from that, right? You know, you work all of your high school years of training to get drafted, to spend 2 years there and then get
delisted or whatever it is,
Yeah, and then what do you do after that?
Well, that's the concern that I have, because, you know, we've been very aware of that research into, multi-sport development for a long time. You know, there's a really cool study, I think it was done by the German Olympic Committee, basically showing the difference between those who medalled and those who just made the team. And one of the big factors was whether you did more than one sport at the age of 16, which I think is a really cool way of demonstrating, you can still get to a good level, but you're not going to be, right at the top. But to me, as I said, it's always really funny, even working, in our lonely sport at times of track, you get kids who come and go, oh, sorry, I can't come to training because I've got footy, and it's your footy season doesn't start for 7 months, so you could probably come to athletics. No, I've got to go because I'm gonna make the NAB team, and you're like, if you're really good, you're probably gonna make it anyway. I don't know what you're worried about.
You're probably going to get more benefit from actually staying here and learning how to run properly.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, and then you also have, so for those that do multiple sports, you then have the challenge of those athletes that are picked for every team, and every team wants them to do...
Because they're athletic in general,
Yeah, every team wants them to do multiple training sessions and all these games on the weekend, and then it's about, okay, well, what are we doing right for this athlete so that we're not all coming from our individual sports and taking what we want from that athlete?
I think the other hard thing too is, particularly when you're thinking of adolescence, is dealing with parents, because it clearly makes sense of wouldn't I just get him or her to focus on this sport now?
Because they're going to become a professional.
Totally. It's why would I get them to do lots of different things? You're going to waste time of their development. And it's this...
That's such a hard education point for parents at
times.
It's
a counterintuitive thing, isn't it? Of you actually need to build diversity in your sensory motor system. That's actually a really important element in that part of your life. But
definitely.
It doesn't really make sense when you think about it from a superficial standpoint.
It just made me think. I don't know if it exists. You may know. There actually should be something to track what kids are doing that actually everyone who has touch points with them has access to. Does that exist? Do you guys...
Sounds like a simple thing, but no. I mean, different sports, different organisations have different ways of tracking
I'm just thinking
athletes.
if it's some sort of application that they kind of track what they're doing, and then if you give access to say, oh, this is my swimming coach, this is my footy coach, this is my rugby sevens coach, they all have access, and maybe they can't. They might be able to write a note in it or something, but they can see, oh, actually you did 14 training sessions this week.
Yeah, maybe take it easy.
Maybe I shouldn't be asking them to play 3 practice matches,
consecutively
on a Saturday.
Yeah.
When, I don't know if that doesn't exist, I don't think, but I think
it exists. I think it would be great to add. So important. I don't think... It also relies on those coaches of those athletes being willing to share the athlete and not think that their sport is most important.
Well, under 14s is really important, don't you know?
And the success of the team based on that individual athlete.
Exactly. Yeah. If they're the star player, then
we're going to win the basketball championship for the under 12s, and we're all going to McDonald's afterwards, Jack.
Speaking of injury prevalence, with the introduction of something like AFLW, there has been this issue of quite a high prevalence of injuries. And I'm interested...
Is it more that it's just becoming obvious because it's actually getting publicity, or do you think that those injuries have always been there?
Again, that's got a multi-level answer to it. It's a bit of both. Yes, we've got more awareness now. AFLW is new, but we have had female athletes play team sports for a long time, and
including in AFL.
Yeah, and they have ACL injuries. It's just now that this is televised that more people can see it and they can see the trauma behind it. But you've also got, it's a really interesting environment, space to study the AFLW in that it was a pretty quick rise to professionalisation of this sport for female athletes. And historical to that, you know, girls had to stop playing at 13 years old or whatever. So
I really struggle with that one because we worked very closely with Darebin Women's Footy Club for a long time. They've been around since the 90s. It's not really true that women couldn't keep playing footy, right? And it keeps getting said a lot, right? And I know players that are retired now who were AFLW players who haven't missed a game since they're 35, 36 now, and they haven't missed a game since they were a kid.
Where were they playing?
In Victoria.
In club teams?
Yeah.
So playing in open club teams?
I'm not sure the exact details, but they were playing all the way through.
Yeah, so I think what it is that there was no specific competition for youth females.
Yeah, that's
and so if someone wanted to play, they're either maybe getting
pushed up into like open teams.
Pushed up into a women's open team, or maybe playing in the youth boys still while people were okay with it.
Yep.
There just wasn't a space for them. So there was no Australian football in schools. There wasn't the youth teams that they could be playing. It's the same with rugby union and rugby sevens. And so some of them absolutely still able to play on the peripheries, but it means that it's not going to the masses. And so you've got some individuals who obviously played at a young age, developed some of those movement patterns and skills, and then have been given this access to play in a professional manner. But lots of them are either coming from different sports and haven't played. I mean, Australian football is a very unique 360 game.
Yeah.
And so your ability to process all of that information is quite unique compared to a lot of other sports.
I had that experience when I moved to Victoria. I grew up playing rugby union. I played a couple of games for college AFL and I was just terrible.
Where do you run? Where do you stand? Totally. I don't know.
You mean I need to look over my shoulder?
I don't just run straight.
Oh, the worst was when someone comes to tackle me, I'd pass it like a rugby pass. I can't do that.
Yeah. And so they just haven't developed some of these movement patterns. You're then going into an elite pathway where they're suddenly training 3-4 times a week. Some people are probably in the gym for the first time ever, really high training loads, and then they're playing on the weekend. So their bodies they don't have the training age, a lot of them. I think it's changing now, and it will be interesting to see in the next 5 years, because we're getting these athletes who have come through bespoke development programs now.
We've seen that really change. It's really, really good.
Yeah, they're stronger bodies. They can handle that contact.
One of the players that I was mentioning that get along really well, she worked very heavily with the AFL in the development program. And she was kind of laughing. She was at the last few years of her career. And she was sort of saying, like, I'm really happy that, you know, I'm going to be finished as these younger players are coming through, like, because they're so much better than we are. Like, their skills are better, they read the game better, they've had so much better coaching.
Better athletes.
Better athletes in general. They're like, she's like, I'm lucky I'm done because I'm screwed if I have to keep going. They're just so much better than me.
And that's coming from access to good coaching staff, because there's now money and, I guess, careers for those coaches of young female athletes, and also that those young athletes are getting into a gym earlier, and it's becoming more normal for girls to be in gyms and to develop muscles and strength, and that's going to help.
Yeah, I think like Jack put it into the question that he sent through, like, do you think that a lot of these injury prevalence we've seen is actually just a training problem? It's just a lack of exposure, and a lot of this will normalise, and those so-called, you know, gender differences will actually diminish, and the gap they will exist because of certain factors.
Yeah.
But that gap will get closer. Do you think that that's likely as we see better exposure to this type of training?
I definitely think it's likely. It's about, training development and movement pattern development as well. So if we can be and it's getting better now. So we're changing how we view girls and women in that they should be in that sport environment, and so they can be developing the right movement patterns to run, kick, throw. And so it's massively going to help improve injury risk. Yes, there is some biomechanical difference between men and women, but at the moment we only know them as biomechanical differences. It's not that
this causes this. We don't know that,
No.
And that's a hard thing for a lot of people to get through, because the second part of the question really is like, I feel like it's being directed too heavily by the research end of things. And you can see my bias, like even though I'm a clinician and even though I have an exercise science background as well, I wear my coaching hat all the time. I feel like this is a coaching problem in the sense that the coaches don't have enough understanding of, as you said, coaching females in the correct way and treating them in a way that is appropriate for that athlete's development to get to where they need to go so that their injury risk profile is at a reasonable and appropriate level.
Yeah. Just because it's different to men doesn't mean it's wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just you work with what you've got and you build it as you would anything else. Yeah.
Like it's something that, because, and again, super biased, you know, with track and field, we've got so much data looking from a coaching perspective, at least, even though it's empirical, but like, we've been training female athletes to extremely high levels of performance for a really long time.
Yeah.
You can push them sometimes way harder than you can even push the men. The men complain when you start pushing them. The women actually go, all right, what else do you want me to do?
Yep.
Right, which I think is actually one of the interesting things that you don't hear a lot of in the team sport stuff, but I think is there if you actually go looking for it. And to me, I think that there's a lot of that knowledge out there. It's just not necessarily being brought into some of these settings quick enough. And there's that integration of, is it valid to use and do we need to research it before we implement it? But I think it is there.
Yeah. I mean, in a team sports setting, there's so many other arguments that you can go to first that show women are not as good as men and it's not comparable. Whereas when you do go to a lot of these other sports, tennis, running, female athletes no different to male athletes.
Well, that's why, like I said, my bias is that I don't think that, particularly from the physiological standpoint, like they're not different. As you said, you work out where their level is, you work out what deficiencies they have, what their strengths are, and then you kind of do your gap analysis and you kind of close that gap as best you can.
Yeah.
You know, some people will tolerate it, some people won't, but you know, that's often individual rather than sex-based. I think it's an interesting space, and I think it's something that I'm hoping these conversations become very different over time. I think they will.
Yeah, I hope so.
Well, you might not have as much research to do, which
that's why I keep it broad. You know? I can play with. Some really interesting research. If we go back to ACL injuries, I'm not sure it's published yet, but some of my colleagues have done it at Latrobe. They were looking at return to play from injury and return to play from ACL specifically. And there's no reason why men and women should have a different return to play from ACL. Really, our physiology, our tendons, our muscles are the exact same.
Similar,
they're the same cells. And yet what they were finding was that, I can't remember the exact number, but women were far less likely to return to play after an ACL injury rather than men.
I think I've seen that, not necessarily
presentation. You would have seen it at the Women in Sport conference.
That's right. That's where it was.
I think is that some of like Brooke Patterson's work or
Andrea Bruder and Brooke Patterson.
Yes, I did see that presentation.
And so part of their discussion there, again, why we can't look purely in isolation of physiology, injury, risk prevention, starting to go broad and go, okay, well, what else is contributing to why females, for some reason, aren't coming back from ACL injuries to the same rate as men? We know that there's a high risk of re-injury in that, but what is it for women? Is it that they're more scared or worried about that re-injury, or do they not have the same support? And so some of their arguments, I think, were coming very much more from that socio-cultural perspective of, well, if a female does an ACL injury, likely they don't have the same access to doctors, physios, and those staff to help in that rehab process. Maybe they get the immediate, but not the long term.
Yeah. Do you think that that's like because it's different at community level, or do you think even at the elite level? Like,
I don't know the breakdown. That's a really interesting question.
Because I think community sport in general is under-resourced. We
Absolutely.
know that. It's becoming more obvious as surveillance of these things is getting, like, you go to a local club and it's a sports trainer who's like managing something that's way beyond their understanding.
Yeah.
You know, and I went through that process as a young studying physio. You're like, I'll go along to the footy club and be a sports trainer. And then you're like, what am I doing? I have no, we had one guy, as a silly example, we had one guy get a really heavy bump and we thought, okay, he's probably broken his ribs because he was feeling horrible. And we're like, go to the hospital. So his partner was there, which is great. They took him to the hospital. They x-rayed and like, you need to go to ICU now.
He ruptured his spleen.
He ruptured his spleen, and they were like, you're going to bleed. Like, you've got to bleed. We need to get you into ICU. And it's like, that's way above my understanding right now. Like, I remember thinking like, thank God we actually like go to the hospital straight away, rather than being like, nah, you'll be right. Like, it's just some sore ribs. Get an x-ray in the next few days. He probably would have died, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I think he would have been smart enough to go to hospital before then. But, like, do you think it's just like community sport in general is under-resourced?
Potentially, but I think even our elite women's programs are still under-resourced compared to the men as well. So they might not be full-time.
That's an interesting one because, like, again, working in a poor sport, we're like, if we had the support that we had for AFLW, like, it'd be amazing. So, like, I get the little violin out when they complain about stuff like that. I'm like,
you're the coach.
I do everything. It's like,
high performance manager.
Yeah, I'm like get the violins out because, I think that one's an interesting one. And that's a personal position.
Yeah.
Like, it's good to see them having more support. I know it's not the same as the men's programs.
Yeah.
But you got a hell of a lot more support than a lot of other people do at the same level of performance, I would say, and sometimes even at a higher level of performance.
And it'd be interesting to see, I think, too, over time, where, like, one, do we see a reduction in ACL prevalence in, say, women's AFL because of that youth development? And does that actually lead to better outcomes for those who do actually have an injury because they have a better baseline and therefore, like, considering the same timeline, you don't have to build up. You go from here to here. You're just going from here to here, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely.
But time will tell.
Yeah, I mean, the last 5-8 years of women's sport has really grown massively. That's probably an accelerated development. It'll be nice to see in the next 5-8 years, which is a bit more of a stabilisation of those athletes and who they are and what that environment looks like. Be interesting to see.
Well, so one question we always ask our guests is there a particular area that you're interested in looking at the moment, either like in research? Maybe for you the question should be, what's the next area that you're going to explore, or something that you're learning that you're particularly interested or excited about?
So some research that we're doing at the moment is around the menstrual cycle, but it's about how coaches and athletes engage and interact with it. So there's a lot of information out there telling all athletes should be tracking their menstrual cycle. Some coaches have awareness and the ability to have the conversations with their athletes. A lot of them are probably deer in the headlights being like, oh, I'm not sure I could do that. And so I guess for me, coming in less from a physiology and pure research perspective and understanding on the ground, okay, well, what does it actually look like for an athlete, for a coach? Do they want to be doing this? Do they care about it? Is it going to change their practice of what they're doing if they suddenly have this information? Because, I mean, if everyone's saying that you need to track all of this stuff, but then coaches aren't able to integrate that with their practice, what's the point? What are we doing it for? So that's where I'm really interested in going at the moment, understand a bit more of that social engagement, interaction with this type of stuff that research is telling you that is important.
I think that's even from a coaching perspective and like I spend a lot more time now reading psychology stuff, reading pedagogy, like teaching, and how you get, because it's so much, you mentioned it before, and I think you're 100% right. It's like, it's so much about relationships.
Yeah.
And I think often, because it's very difficult to quantify these things, the research doesn't keep up with the amount of progression that needs to happen in the relationship side of things for, even if it is something that is quantifiable, to be implemented.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got something that's like, we can measure this and we know that we get good outcomes with this, but it's not being communicated well and it's not translating. It's like, well, there's no, you could know everything and know how to fix it, but it's not translating to anything.
Well, and I think just to add on to that too is, you know, you have this generalist mindset approach, which is something that we certainly adopt in our philosophy too, of understanding humans as complex adaptive systems, understanding that there is so many things that are potentially going on. But how do you actually change or implement that mindset into other people, coaches, clinicians, whoever, researchers, whoever it may be? And then more importantly, even if you do develop that mindset, what do you actually do with that information? Because like if someone says that they, like if talking about a female athlete where they're having issues related to their menstrual cycle, what changes do you actually make? And like, should you actually make changes?
Can I ask on that? Is there anything in the research at the moment that you do think, you know, you mentioned before, we're not 100% certain what the effect is on performance.
Yeah.
Do you think there are things that we actually are a little bit more, this is me trying to steal knowledge from you. Is there anything that we are clear on that maybe we should be trying to do from the menstrual cycle research at the moment? I'm getting free advice here.
Some preliminary findings are suggesting that maybe there is some potential benefit of doing more strength-based training at the start of your cycle. But there's not enough to really hang your hat on it. I would say at this stage that don't do anything performance-related based on your menstrual cycle, and I think menstrual cycle tracking should purely be from a health perspective and an athlete getting better awareness of their own body and how they're responding and how they're interacting between their menstrual cycle and any sort of training nutrition that they're doing.
This is a question I am going to ask you. Sorry to hijack this.
Go for it.
We've spoken often about the separation that starts to happen when you get towards high level of sport performance between performance and health.
Yeah.
Right? They start to diverge at a certain point where doing more physical activity is probably not that good for you. What do you think is the responsibility as people associated with that, whether it's professionals, you know, practitioners, coaches, sports science, to the performance side of things versus that individual's health? Because I probably, and I'll get myself in trouble here, but I probably would say that, like, I've had issues with some of the discussions that I've had with the dietitian that we work with, because they're so concerned with the health of the athlete that they almost think like it doesn't matter if they're over their performance weight as long as they're healthy, but their performance may actually struggle. And I'm like, I would like to be standing right on that line. I don't want to step over it, but I'm happy to stand on it. And they're like, nah, stand a few meters back from that, please.
Yeah.
What do you see is the responsibility there for people involved in that?
It's definitely a tightrope that you have to walk. And I think, like, if you're an elite athlete, you're pushing those boundaries. That's what an elite athlete is, and that's what they do. I think the best way to manage that is that you're not walking a tightrope every single day of the year, that you go up to that line, hopefully not cross it for a
long period,
touch into it for a bit, and then pull back a bit and allow that normal period and then go back into it.
Because one of the interesting things that I see with it is if it's physical health, say like a joint or something, you would have seen it a lot, I'm sure, a lot in working in sevens. It's like, oh, just jab that, right? And athletes are actually very happy with that.
Yes.
But the moment that it actually relates to something, some sort of like internal health thing, they're like, oh, no, maybe we shouldn't push that. And it's like, to me, I don't really separate the two too much. It's like, if your knee joint is completely degraded by the time you're 35 and you can't walk around, it's going to affect you just as much as, you know, potentially some other internal health thing, right? And you don't realize that now because you're younger and you're focused, as you said before, you're obsessive about getting the result. I think that's an interesting kind of interplay, because I don't know that we talk to people about, like, your physical health is being degraded here. We keep doing these injections into your knee joint or whatever it is.
It's funny what you normalise.
Yeah, versus, females, they've lost their menstrual cycle because of, energy insufficiency. Yeah. And them going, I'm really concerned about that, I need to get that sorted, versus, no, I've had 14 injections in my knee this season to play. And it's like, to me, they're both really bad health outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. One is not less important than the other. I think, I probably realised or really noticed this a couple of months ago, where I went back and went to collect some data on just a club women's rugby team, and forgot how many of club athletes are strapping themselves just to move around the park, and that they're struggling but they love it. And it's that balance of good that you're out there moving but your body is already shot. I feel like there's always going to be a little bit of it. You can't completely avoid any of those elements potentially. It's just trying to minimise how much damage and how much effect they play.
And not that this is necessarily a question that's in your area, but you probably have more exposure than we have, do you think with the professionalisation of sport, and I see almost like the, what is it? It's like the occupational kind of development of sport. You're seeing, particularly in AFL, I've noticed that a lot of like Players Association, and they're getting a lot more power. Some people think that's good, some people think that's bad, but there's a lot more like things built into their contracts. Like, we need this amount of time off, and we want this, and we want this, and we want this.
Yeah.
Do you think there's going to have to be a change with stuff like we just mentioned, where you need to actually really explain to me what the long-term ramifications of me doing this is, because you obviously don't want them coming back years later and be like, there's not informed consent about...
There are cases of that too, like what we know about of...
Well, concussion's a big one, obviously.
Or a particular medical condition of like, all right, well, we can do this, and then end up having further problems down the track. And
I don't have an answer for you. It's an interesting one. And there's also like catch-22 sometimes of from a contract and what you can and can't do. In the AFLW, they're limited to how many hours they can spend at the club because they're not getting paid enough to be more. But then...
are they under-preparing them because you actually haven't given them access?
Yeah, exactly.
That's a big one.
And so how do you balance all of that? There's no right answer, unfortunately, and there's probably a lot of grey, and it's just about, with the information that we have now, what's the best way to move forward and to balance all of those competing interests. And that's, again, why you can't just look individually at one component, but there's so many factors that come into play for all of those decisions.
All right. We've just ticked over an hour and 7, so we've done pretty well. Anthea, we can't thank you enough. It's actually been a really, really informative discussion. I suspect we may be asking you to come back on, because I think we just touched the surface. But thank you so much for coming out and spending time with us.
Thanks for having me. It's a lot of fun.